He was just the janitor, Ronald Garrison, invisible to students, ignored by faculty. But when Professor Elias Thorne, Belmont's crown jewel, wrote an unbeatable equation to humiliate and filter out the students he deemed unworthy, one camera caught Ronald solving it in under 4 minutes. No applause, no promotion. Instead, he was accused of cheating. What they didn't know, Ronald once held a scholarship to MIT, until one racist arrest erased his future. And now, he's back, not as a janitor, but as a professor. And his first lesson, that brilliance doesn't need permission. But when a student named Jamila Reed solves that same equation faster than he ever did, the revolution he started takes on a life of its own. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. In the heart of Missouri, nestled among golden oak trees and historic red brick buildings, Belmont Ivy University stood like a cathedral of intellect. Its ivy-draped towers reached upward with the arrogance of age-old prestige, a silent testament to over 2 centuries of exclusivity. The university boasted Nobel laureates, CEOs, senators, and Pulitzer winners among its alumni. Every hallway whispered the legacy of privilege. Every polished tile reflected the institution's carefully curated image of intellectual dominance. But behind the marble statues and echoing lecture halls was a quieter truth, one never spoken aloud, but always understood. Belmont didn't just reward intelligence. It rewarded the right kind of intelligence, the kind with lineage, with the right pedigree, with names etched on donor plaques and family photos framed in boardroom walls. Belmont was a kingdom with open gates, but only certain keys unlocked the real doors. Ronald Garrison had no such key. And yet every morning at 5 a.m., he entered those same gates with a ring of his own, a ring of janitorial keys, each one a silent reminder of the spaces he was allowed to touch, but never belonged to. He pushed his cart through the empty corridors before the students arrived, wiping away fingerprints from glass doors and emptying wastebaskets stuffed with coffee cups and half-finished papers. He was a ghost among scholars, his presence acknowledged only by the echo of his footsteps. Ronald was in his mid-50s, with a worn face that carried more wisdom than wrinkles. His uniform, navy blue and faded at the elbows, bore the embroidered patch, facility staff. But his eyes, sharp and unreadable, told a deeper story. Students often passed him without a glance. Faculty nodded with polite distance, and administrators never said his name. He wasn't Ronald to them, just the janitor. Yet no one knew that Ronald once stood on a stage, in Boston, at age 17, holding a trophy nearly half his size after winning a national math competition. No one remembered the black boy, who at 19, published a groundbreaking theorem in a peer-reviewed journal. The boy who once solved complex proofs in minutes that took others days. His photo had once been on the cover of American Mathematics Monthly, praised as the next genius of the century. But genius wasn't enough. Not when you were young, black, and outspoken. One false accusation, one unjust arrest at a protest rally, and his academic future dissolved like chalk in rain. A professor withdrew his recommendation. A donor threatened funding. A court date replaced his interview at Princeton. He was offered a plea deal, a lesser charge in exchange for his silence. With his reputation smeared, scholarships vanished. The university cut ties, and just like that, Ronald Garrison, once hailed as the future of mathematics, was swept out of academia like dust on marble floors. Now, decades later, he moved through Belmont, like a shadow. He knew the smell of every hallway, the rhythm of every squeaky hinge, the feel of worn carpet beneath his boots. But what no one knew was that his mind, once forged in the fires of differential geometry and abstract algebra, still burned quietly beneath the surface. He had no whiteboard, no classroom, no audience, only the occasional glimpse of formulas left half-solved on lecture hall boards, or scribbles in students' discarded notebooks. Sometimes when no one was around, he'd pause in lecture hall B, the room with the highest ceilings and worst acoustics, and just stare at the chalkboard. Equations lingered there from the night before, relics of complex discussions. Ronald would look at them, not with envy, but with clarity. He saw their errors instantly, their flaws, their beauty. There was one professor, however, who caught his attention more than the rest. Elias Thorne. Professor Thorne was the golden boy of Belmont's math department. A tenured legend with salt and pepper hair, horn-rimmed glasses, and a vocabulary as sharp as his suits. Thorne taught advanced theoretical mathematics, and relished in intimidation. He spoke with conviction, citing obscure European mathematicians like old friends, and often told his students, "Genius is not democratic." Every semester he scrawled a problem on the board, what he called the unbeatable equation. He claimed it was unsolved in academic circles, an enigma even he couldn't crack. It became his trademark, an annual academic ritual that separated the brilliant from the mediocre. What Thorne never said publicly was that the problem wasn't actually unsolved. It was just purposefully twisted. A mathematical labyrinth that required insight, not training. He used it to humble the overconfident. He delighted in watching students struggle. It was intellectual hazing cloaked as tradition. Ronald had seen it once, only once, written late at night during a winter semester 3 years prior. He'd paused, staring at the structure of the symbols, the looping logic, the intentional misdirection buried in the variables. He didn't solve it then. He didn't need to. He already knew he could. But that wasn't his place anymore. He erased the thought with the same rag he used to wipe the chalk trays. But time does something strange to the human soul. Especially a soul forced to stay silent. It compresses, tightens, hardens, and sometimes even the most disciplined restraint finds a crack. On a cold Tuesday morning in late October, Lecture Hall B was unusually quiet. The class had ended early. Professor Thorne's unbeatable equation was once again splayed across the board. Bigger, bolder, nastier than before. Students had tried for weeks. No one had come close. A few had taken photos and posted them online, spurring debate in math forums. Still, it remained unbroken. Ronald entered with his cart. He began his routine, emptying bins, sweeping under seats, wiping down desks. But then he paused. The board was still filled with Thorne's challenge. Long arcs of chalk danced in an intricate web of numbers and logic. Ronald stared at it. Something inside him shifted. It wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't ego. It was something deeper, the feeling of an old instrument calling out to its master. He felt it in his fingertips, the same way a pianist feels the piano keys before the first note. His breathing slowed. He glanced at the clock. No classes for another hour. No footsteps in the hall. The security camera blinked red from the corner of the room, but he didn't care. Ronald walked slowly to the board. His hands were still gloved from cleaning. He pulled them off, picked up a fresh piece of chalk, and without fanfare, without audience, he began to write. He didn't hesitate. Every stroke was confident, every symbol placed with intention. In under 3 minutes, the unbeatable equation was solved. Clean, elegant, undeniable. He stepped back, looked at it once, then turned, grabbed his gloves, and left the room. He didn't know someone had been watching. A chalkboard left unattended in lecture hall. B would soon alter the campus forever. Professor Elias Thorne had long established himself as the intellectual monarch of Belmont Ivy University. In the grand ballroom of academic prestige, he was both conductor and gatekeeper. With his perfectly pressed charcoal suit's meticulously parted hair, and voice that carried like scripture in a cathedral, he commanded a kind of reverence reserved only for those who were both brilliant and cruel. He didn't just teach mathematics, he ruled it, and his rule came with ritual. At the start of every academic year, Thorne presented what he theatrically called the unbeatable equation. It had become his legacy, an enormous mind-bending formula scrawled across the length of the chalkboard. In Lecture Hall B, to students it was a monster, a test of grit, an academic Everest, designed to humble even the boldest prodigies. But to Thorne it was more than that. It was his unspoken hierarchy, a public tool to subtly reinforce who belonged at Belmont, and who didn't. Year after year, students from privileged backgrounds crowded into his classroom, eager to prove themselves. The white sons of attorneys, the daughters of legacy alumni, the tech startup heirs, they were his favorite audience. They failed, of course, all of them, but Thorne never expected success. He expected struggle. It thrilled him to remind the eager minds just how far below genius they still were. Each failed attempt was followed by a soft, rehearsed smile from Thorne. "Don't be discouraged," he would say. "Genius reveals itself only to the few." The phrase became gospel within the department. It was repeated in the hallways, parodied in student groups, even printed on sweatshirts sold by the Belmont Mathematics Club. Thorne didn't mind. His ego fed on it all. The fear, the admiration, even the mockery. What no one ever questioned was why the equation had never been solved. Was it truly unsolvable, or was it crafted to be unsolvable? In truth, Thorne had engineered it for failure. The equation wasn't pure math. It was performance. It relied on obscure constructs, buried theorems, and dead-end patterns that gave the illusion of progress, but ended in academic quicksand. Anyone who tried to dissect it without the exact combination of insight and intuition would waste weeks. But Thorne never worried, because no one ever got close. Until one fall semester, the semester when Ronald Garrison began lingering just a few seconds longer in Lecture Hall B. Ronald, ever invisible to most, had begun taking his breaks there, quietly standing at the edge of the room, while students buzzed and muttered in frustration over Thorne's beast of a problem. He never interrupted, never commented, just watched, listened. There was something in the way Thorne spoke that rubbed at a scar deep within Ronald. Not just arrogance, but dismissal. It wasn't personal, not on the surface. Thorne didn't know Ronald. He never glanced twice at the janitor, wiping down the podium, or emptying the trash. But it was the tone, the performative indifference, the casual elitism, dripping from every word. This, Thorne had once said, pointing at the problem with a piece of chalk held like a weapon, separates those who study from those who understand. Ronald had paused mid-mop. He knew that tone. He'd heard it years ago from a judge, from a former professor who rescinded his letter of recommendation after a single arrest, from a police officer who once said, "You're too smart for your own good." Now here it was again, dressed in formulas and false authority. The students tried, again and again, but their answers never lasted a day on the board. Thorne would erase them with quiet satisfaction, leave cryptic notes like "elegant but incorrect," or revisit modular structures. They'd murmur, take photos, debate late into the night. Ronald watched it all. And slowly, he began to see the cracks. He hadn't touched a theorem in over 20 years. But the part of his brain trained to chase complexity had never shut off. It had just gone dormant, buried beneath years of quiet rage and janitorial routines. One Tuesday evening, as a group of honors students debated a step in the corner of the chalkboard, Ronald stood alone at the back, staring at the problem like an old rival re-entering his life. He didn't write, didn't whisper. But inside something was rising. Thorne, in his arrogance, had made a mistake. He'd left a small, almost imperceptible flaw in the middle section of the equation, a loop of logic that led nowhere. It was designed to mislead, to trap solvers in an infinite regress. Most wouldn't even see it. But Ronald did. Because Ronald didn't approach problems the way Belmont trained students to. He didn't follow systems, he challenged them. His mind, once sharpened by self-study, by survival, by the need to prove his worth in rooms built to erase him, saw past the trick. He saw the structure beneath the showmanship. And just like that, the unbeatable equation was. He didn't solve it right away. He didn't need to. He walked out that evening with the answer already forming like a quiet storm behind his eyes. The solution was not only possible, it was simple, once you knew where to look. Devastatingly simple, and that realization more than anything shook him. Because the equation wasn't a monument of genius. It was a gate, designed not to challenge, but to exclude. For the next few nights, Ronald returned to Lecture Hall B a little earlier than his shift required. Always alone, always quiet. He'd stand in front of the board, after the students left, tracing the symbols in his mind, confirming his theory. He could feel it now, not just the answer, but the insult. The insult of decades wasted in silence. The insult of a system that had replaced his intellect with a mop. The insult of men like Thorne who wore brilliance like a shield to hide their fear of being challenged, especially by someone they deemed unworthy. Then came Thursday. The campus was half empty that night, a faculty mixer occupying most of the professors. Ronald had finished his rounds early. Lecture Hall B was empty. The chalkboard was untouched from earlier that day, still bearing the unbeatable equation, now messier with new failed solutions, scribbled around the edges. He stood in the center of the room, hands resting on the mop handle like a cane. The air smelled faintly of chalk and ambition. He walked to the board slowly, his boots silent on the cold tile. He reached for the chalk. At first his hand trembled, not from doubt, but from restraint. For years he'd conditioned himself not to rise, not to push back, not to draw attention. But now, with no eyes watching, no voices to interrupt, he allowed himself to be what he once was. The chalk met the board. He moved with precision. No hesitation. Each mark erased weeks of failure. Each line corrected Thorne's flawed logic. He flipped the loop on itself, bypassed the regress, and restructured the core in a way that made the whole thing collapse, gracefully. What had been a wall now opened like a door. It took him exactly 4 minutes. Ronald stepped back, wiped the chalk dust from his fingers onto his pants, and looked at the equation one last time. For the first time in 2 decades, he saw proof of his mind, not in memory, but in action. And it was beautiful. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. He simply walked away. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that Thorne had been testing a new classroom surveillance system. A small, near-invisible camera had been installed 2 days earlier. It was motion-triggered, and it had recorded everything. One late night, Ronald Garrison picked up a piece of chalk. The lecture hall was silent. Rows of empty chairs faced the vast whiteboard, the last remnants of sunlight filtering through the tall, arched windows of Belmont Ivy University. Chalk dust floated lazily in the air, catching the golden light as if time itself were pausing to witness something extraordinary. Beneath the glow, an equation loomed like a monolith, dense, brutal, unapologetically complex. It had broken minds for over a decade, a wall of arrogance disguised as academia. Ronald Garrison stood at the back of Lecture Hall B, mop in one hand, eyes fixed on the formula like an old soldier, recognizing an enemy. The bucket of water by his side had long gone still. In that moment, the world seemed to fall away. He didn't see symbols, he saw rhythm. Notation became memory. Logic flowed through his veins like a native tongue returning home. He slowly walked to the front. The echo of his footsteps, once ordinary, now resonated with a strange gravity. He set the mop aside and picked up a fresh piece of chalk left beside the board. It felt familiar, almost sacred in his grip. A forgotten extension of himself. There were no spectators, no applause, just the hum of the old fluorescent lights and the quiet roar of brilliance reawakening. Ronald took one breath and began. With eerie precision, he moved across the board. The initial lines came like muscle memory, quick, fluid, confident. But as the problem deepened, his mind didn't slow. Instead, it accelerated, peeling back layers of deception woven into the equation. What Thorne had designed to confound others was, to Ronald, a broken story needing completion. He didn't scribble. He sculpted. Each stroke was intentional. Each symbol a revelation. It wasn't about ego or revenge. It was about reclaiming a voice. Years of silence, of watching lesser minds praised for lesser truths, had honed him into something razor sharp. In less than 8 minutes he stepped back, breathing steady. The solution spanned the width of the board. Elegant, terrifyingly accurate. The answer lay at the bottom, encircled neatly like a final heartbeat. And just like that he returned the chalk, picked up his mop, and walked away. Hours later, a group of graduate students entered for a late-night study session. They froze mid-step, jaws slack, as they saw the board. One of them, Martin Lowell, a doctoral candidate who'd tried solving that equation over 6 semesters, gasped, "No way. That can't be right." They gathered around, checking each step with calculators, textbooks, and software. 15 minutes passed, then 30, an hour. None could find a flaw. "This is correct," whispered Jennifer Kim, stunned. "It's not just right, it's beautiful." Word spread like wildfire. Within hours, students from other departments poured into Lecture Hall B. They stared in disbelief, took photos, shared theories. The equation, once a monument to futility, now stood solved. An anonymous triumph. By morning the board was trending on social media. Hashtags emerged. Dylan Chalk Miracle, Math Ghost, Belmont Mystery. Local news vans camped outside the university, sniffing for answers. Rumors erupted. A rogue professor, a visiting scholar, a prank by AI students. It didn't take long for administration to investigate. Security tapes were pulled, carefully reviewed in silence by a small team of deans and guards. The footage was simple, undeniable. There, in black and white, stood Ronald Garrison, the janitor, mop in one hand, chalk in the other. The room fell into a stunned hush. No one moved. Dean Pritchard, known for his harsh standards and colder demeanor, leaned forward. "Rewind that," he ordered. They watched again, Ronald walking in, pausing, then solving the equation with calm efficiency. No hesitation, no cheating, no assistant. "This must be doctored," someone muttered. He probably copied it from somewhere. But there was nothing to copy. The equation was Thorne's own creation, Unpublished, unshared, entirely original. It had never existed outside that whiteboard. By noon, the tape leaked. The footage hit the internet like a lightning bolt. The world watched a janitor, a black man in overalls and worn sneakers, solve an Ivy League nightmare in real time. And he didn't gloat. He didn't even smile. He just walked away, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Reactions exploded. Some called it a miracle. Others claimed it had to be staged. Many couldn't believe a janitor could do what tenured professors couldn't. News anchors debated his legitimacy. Influencers celebrated him as a hero. Yet in the heart of Belmont, the institution flinched. Not from pride. From fear. Professor Elias Thorne, the very architect of the equation, was notified mid-lecture. He paused, then scowled as his assistant showed him the footage. Impossible, he snapped. He must have had help. But Thorne wasn't worried about the math. He was worried about control. Because if Ronald had done this alone, what did it say about the system that let him mop floors instead of write textbooks? What did it say about the gates Thorne helped guard? The lies he helped tell about who belonged in brilliance and who didn't? A closed-door meeting was held that evening. Thorne insisted the board denounce the footage, claim tampering, call it a hoax. But the dean hesitated. Public pressure was mounting. In the dorms, in the cafeteria, on every phone screen, Ronald's face played on loop. But he wasn't speaking. He wasn't posting. He wasn't even aware of the firestorm. At that very moment, he was in the boiler room, fixing a leak. That night, Belmont's student paper released an editorial. Why are we more comfortable believing in ghosts than black geniuses? It went viral within minutes. By morning, someone had printed a blown-up image of the solved equation and taped it to the president's office door with a single line scrawled underneath. He mops your floors better than you solve your problem. Security footage revealed the solver, and it wasn't a student. The footage spread faster than wildfire. It began as a whisper among Belmont Ivy students. A few screenshots, a shaky phone recording of a security monitor, then the footage itself, Ronald Garrison, the university janitor, calmly walking into Lecture Hall B, picking up a piece of chalk, and solving Professor Elias Thorne's unbeatable equation in less than 4 minutes. It hit Twitter first, then Reddit. Within hours, it was trending nationally. The headline ignited like gasoline on dry brush. Black janitor solves Ivy League math riddle in seconds. The video stunned the public. Millions watched Ronald glide through the equation, with a calm confidence that felt almost supernatural. To the average viewer, it looked like a moment of divine intervention, the underdog triumphing over elitism. But to Belmont's administration, it was something else entirely, a threat. In the first wave of reactions, there was awe. Professors from other institutions began commenting, "Who is this man? This is the most elegant solution I've seen. We need to find him." Some even called it a mathematical miracle. But within hours, that awe curdled into suspicion, and the suspicion had a sharp edge, one born of prejudice. On Belmont's internal faculty forum, threads began to appear. Could this have been staged? We need to verify that he didn't have access to the solution in advance. Is he even qualified to attempt this? They didn't ask how he solved it. They asked how a janitor even dared to try. Ronald, meanwhile, said nothing. He continued reporting to work, emptying trash bins, and wiping down chalkboards. Students began to stare longer, some whispering, others nodding at him with nervous respect. But the staff avoided eye contact. Some went out of their way to change their routes, bypassing him entirely. The same hands that once reached out to shake his when he swept the lecture halls were now clenched behind backs. On social media, the story had taken on a life of its own. News anchors replayed the footage with dramatic overlays. TikToks broke down the math in layman's terms. Instagram posts turned him into a symbol of untapped genius. But while the internet was beginning to celebrate Ronald, Belmont was busy defending its identity. It wasn't long before the university released a statement. Dry, sterile, calculated. We are aware of an incident involving unauthorized use of academic facilities, after hours. While we acknowledge the curiosity generated by recent footage circulating online, we are currently reviewing the matter to ensure academic integrity is upheld. That sentence, unauthorized use of academic facilities, struck like a slap. They didn't call him brilliant. They didn't thank him. They labeled him a violator, a rule breaker, a janitor who forgot his place. Within minutes, the backlash began. So if a white professor had solved it, would it be called an incident?
This is what institutional racism looks like. Live.
Belmont just told us exactly what kind of school it is. But the louder the support grew online, the deeper the skepticism festered within Belmont's walls. Faculty meetings became tense. Department heads questioned the footage's authenticity. Rumors surfaced that Ronald had been seen peeking into professors' offices, hinting he might have copied the solution. Some even accused students of helping him in secret. Behind closed doors, they began treating Ronald not as a prodigy, but a problem. Meanwhile, Elias Thorne said nothing publicly. Not at first. But the silence didn't mean surrender. It meant strategy. Thorne wasn't just a professor. He was Belmont's intellectual cornerstone. And his authority had been undermined by a man who, in the university's eyes, had no right to lift chalk in the first place. To let Ronald's solution stand without challenge was to admit weakness, to concede that genius existed beyond Belmont's control. And that for Thorne was unacceptable. So he prepared his counter. 2 days later, Thorne appeared on a panel hosted by Belmont's mathematics department, disguised as a round table on academic integrity. Students packed the auditorium. Faculty lined the back wall. Media outlets were blocked from entering, but cameras still rolled, streamed live for educational transparency. Thorne stood at the center of the stage, calm as always. Poised, controlled. "I want to begin," he said, "by stating that I do not discredit intellectual curiosity, wherever it may come from. However, as stewards of rigorous education, we have a responsibility to ensure that all academic achievements are earned, verifiable, and above all, replicable." He didn't name Ronald directly. But everyone knew. Therefore, Thorne continued, "In the spirit of fairness, and with full respect to the individual in question, I am formally requesting a public demonstration. Let him solve another equation. Live, unassisted, in front of faculty, students, and cameras." The room fell into murmurs. It was framed as an invitation. But it was a challenge, and a trap. Ronald wasn't a student. He wasn't accustomed to blackboards under pressure or stadiums full of doubters. He didn't belong to their club, didn't speak their coded language of peer review and methodology. He was being summoned not to shine, but to fail. Still, word reached him quickly. A junior student named Leo, one of the few who had spoken kindly to Ronald before all this, delivered the news personally. He found Ronald cleaning a stairwell and held up his phone with the announcement. "They want you to solve something else," Leo said quietly. On stage, in front of the whole campus. Ronald wiped his hands on his work pants and looked at the screen. His expression didn't change. "I see," he murmured. "You don't have to do it," Leo added quickly. "This is a setup, man. They want to watch you fall." Ronald gave a faint, tired smile. "They've wanted that my whole life." Leo stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. "Are you going to do it?" Ronald didn't answer. Not yet. His mind was already elsewhere. Not on the equation they might throw at him, but on the history buried behind this moment. This wasn't about math anymore. This was about erasure, about reclaiming space that was never given, about being seen not as a fluke, but as fact. That evening, the story took another turn. A whistleblower inside the university, an anonymous staff member, leaked internal emails to a popular journalist. The emails revealed that Belmont officials had debated whether to suspend Ronald while they investigated his behavior. One line stood out, sent from a high-ranking dean. "We cannot allow this to become precedent. We must protect the reputation of our faculty above all." The internet exploded. Petitions flooded in demanding Ronald be recognized and compensated. Hashtags trended, on "Let Ronald Speak" and "Math Has No Uniform." Scholars from around the world, Black professors, tech innovators, and mathematicians, rallied behind Ronald. They shared their own stories of exclusion, of being mistaken for assistants, janitors, frauds. The story was no longer just about him. It was about every system that had dismissed Black brilliance as coincidence. Still, the university held firm. No apologies, no reversals, just the impending public test, orchestrated by Elias Thorne. The next morning, a university-wide email was sent. "To ensure full transparency and academic fairness, Mr. Ronald Garrison has been invited to participate in a live mathematical demonstration on Friday, at 2 p.m. in Lecture Hall B. The session will be streamed live and archived for academic review." It was official. They weren't just questioning his intellect. They were putting him on trial. Professor Thorne demanded a public test in front of faculty and media. Belmont Ivy University had never seen anything like it. Lecture Hall B, typically a sanctuary of structured lectures and quiet academia, had been transformed into something more theatrical. A stage, a trial, a spectacle. Every seat in the tiered hall was filled. Students sat shoulder to shoulder, some on the stairs, others cross-legged by the walls. The low murmur of whispered anticipation bounced off the stone and steel. A small army of cameras had been allowed in by special exception. Local news, student media, even a documentary crew that just happened to be on campus filming a project about academic equity. All of them pointed their lenses toward the front of the room. At the center stood Ronald Garrison, Belmont's most unlikely math candidate. His navy janitorial uniform was pressed, his boots polished. He stood calmly beside the whiteboard with his cleaning cart slightly off to the side, mop neatly parked in its holder like a forgotten staff. The moment felt absurd and profound at once, as if a myth were about to be tested under fluorescent lights. Professor Elias Thorne stood to Ronald's left, gripping a black leather folder. His presence was as controlled as ever, hair perfectly parted, expression unreadable. But beneath the surface, something churned. He was not used to being questioned. He was not used to giving up ground. The dean, standing near the podium, gave the opening remarks. Today's session, she announced, is not an examination, but a demonstration, a gesture toward academic transparency and intellectual fairness. Her words were clinical, her tone stiff, her eyes never quite meeting Ronald's. Then Thorne took over. He approached the whiteboard with a wireless remote and clicked. A massive equation appeared on the projector screen, winding, sprawling, and almost cruel in its complexity. A hybrid of advanced topology and theoretical game theory, designed not to illuminate, but to disorient. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even the students who prided themselves on mathematical fluency couldn't fully parse it. This, Thorne declared, is a new problem, not yet published, not rehearsed. It was developed with input from 3 of my senior colleagues, and contains constructs not available in any textbook or online journal. He turned slowly toward Ronald. You may begin when ready. Ronald stepped forward, slowly but without hesitation. The room held its breath. He took a moment, scanning the board. His fingers twitched slightly, the kind of unconscious movement that belongs to people who carry fluency in their bones. Then, in a quiet voice that somehow reached the far back row, he said, "I'll need a marker." A student assistant scurried up with a tray. Ronald selected a black marker, uncapped it, and turned to face the sprawling beast of a problem. He began. No dramatics, no flourish, just calculation. But not the kind that was robotic. This was a dance. Every line he wrote was clean, deliberate, built on the invisible architecture of decades-old intuition. He worked from the left edge, section by section, not erasing or backtracking. Each stroke connected with the next like a story unfolding. Students began to shift in their seats. The earlier amusement, that quiet assumption that this would be a charming failure, began to morph into unease. Whispers crept through the room. He's not guessing. He actually knows what he's doing. Wait, is that right? Professor Thorne, who had returned to his seat, leaned forward ever so slightly. His jaw tightened. Ronald reached the midsection of the equation, a stretch built on obscure logic, deliberately constructed to entrap. He paused briefly. Then, with 2 elegant substitutions, he bypassed it. Not bulldozed, bypassed, like a man who saw a maze from above. By now, even those with no math background could feel the gravity of what was happening. This wasn't an amateur punching above his weight. This was a master returning to familiar terrain. And yet, the applause didn't come. Instead, murmurs of doubt rose. Did someone coach him? There has to be a trick. Maybe he saw the solution in Thorne's office. The disbelief wasn't mathematical. It was racial. It was social. Ronald didn't look like the solvers they were taught to believe in. And the more perfect his solution became, the louder the suspicion grew. Ronald kept writing. His hands never trembled. His focus never wavered. When he finally reached the final segment, a deceptive loop designed to collapse all previous logic if misunderstood, he handled it with surgical precision. He rewrote a single term, reframed the logic entirely, and with that the entire equation resolved into clarity. He stepped back, marker down, hands at his sides. No triumph in his expression, just quiet, heavy resolve. For a long second the room was utterly still. Then, instead of cheers, came resistance. A faculty member stood. "We'll need to audit the solution." Another added, there should be a formal review panel. He bypassed standard validation. And from Thorne, the approach was unconventional. A solution isn't just the end, it's the path taken. And we don't yet know where his path came from. Ronald didn't respond. He didn't need to. Because suddenly, from the back row, a voice rose. Confident, sharp. I do. Heads turned. A woman stood up. Dana Whitmore, Belmont alum, Math Olympiad champion. A visiting scholar for the semester. I've solved that exact structure before, she said, pointing to the board. What he did wasn't just right. It was elegant. He rewrote the language. And if you can't recognize that, Professor Thorne, maybe it's your understanding that needs review. Ronald didn't flinch. He asked for a marker. The marker clicked in Ronald's hand, a sound so soft it could have been ignored. But in the silence of Lecture Hall B, it was seismic. Dozens of eyes locked onto him. He approached the whiteboard slowly, like a man pacing out the first step onto a frozen lake, not from fear of failure but of what his success might shatter. With steady breath and a blank expression, Ronald lifted the marker. His posture was relaxed but controlled, like a violinist before the first note. No theatrics, no hesitation, just math. He started writing. Not frantically, not nervously, deliberately. His hand moved with an economy of motion, like each line had been pre-written in his mind long ago. The symbols flowed into one another like fluent conversation. Logic unfolded like a story, each variable layered with intent. He didn't stop to erase, he didn't backtrack, he simply progressed. In the audience, whispers began to flutter. He's doing it. He can't be right, can he? This doesn't make sense. That equation's a beast. Professor Thorne sat in the front row, one leg crossed over the other, his arms folded tightly. His face remained frozen in academic neutrality, but his eyes darted with microscopic tension. Every line Ronald drew tightened a knot in Thorne's gut. This wasn't showmanship. This wasn't lucky intuition. It was mastery, and Thorne knew it. 10 minutes in, Ronald transitioned from the dense, intentionally misleading opening segment to the recursive core of the equation. He didn't pause. He saw through it. He untangled the recursion with a grace that stunned the graduate students watching, many of whom had spent weeks just trying to interpret that portion alone. Someone in the second row gasped. He's skipping steps. No, a voice beside her corrected. He's not skipping. He just doesn't need them. By the 20-minute mark, the entire hall was silent. The only sound was the squeak of the marker. Phones were forgotten. Note-taking ceased. Everyone was witnessing something rare. Genius, pure and unfiltered, refusing to be contained by social class or institutional gatekeeping. And yet the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, because beneath the awe, something else was rising. Resistance. A few faculty members exchanged glances. One whispered to another, "Is someone feeding him through an earpiece? He must have rehearsed it. Could it be memorized? Maybe someone gave him the answer beforehand." The doubt wasn't logical. It was emotional. Racism never announced itself at full volume. It crept in with casual disbelief, cloaked in reasonable skepticism. Ronald reached the final segment of the equation. This portion wasn't just complicated, it was philosophical. A part of the formula involved abstract representation meant to simulate paradoxical logic. Thorne had added it not as a final challenge, but as a mathematical noose, a trap disguised as elegance. Even his brightest protégés had failed to complete it. Ronald didn't even blink. He walked through it as if he had written it himself. He identified the paradox's trigger and dismantled it with a series of substitutions that made the entire construction collapse inward, revealing a clean, simple, and devastatingly accurate conclusion. Then he put the marker down. He stepped back, quiet, still. He didn't bow, didn't smile. He didn't seek applause. He didn't speak at all, because the work spoke louder than any voice could. The equation, once dubbed unbeatable, now sat conquered, demystified, and undeniably solved. But the applause didn't come. For a long moment the room sat in stunned stillness. Then, slowly, a murmur, not of admiration, but of discontent. Something's off. He couldn't have done that. Not like this. From the far right of the auditorium, a professor rose. "I want to see his notes," she said. Another chimed in. "We'll need to verify each segment. It could be copied from somewhere." Someone from the journalism department whispered. They'd be cheering if he were white. Thorne stood now. His face was composed, but strained, like a man trying to hold water in cupped hands. Well, he said calmly, it was a noble attempt. But without peer review, we cannot validate such an unorthodox process. The logic appears, untested. Gasps. Even some of his own students flinched. One dared to raise her hand. Professor, you always said elegance and clarity are proof. That was the most elegant solution I've ever seen. Thorne's eyes narrowed. It was fast, not necessarily correct. And that was the spark. In the back row, a hand shot up. Tall, strong, deliberate. The room turned. She stood. Dana Whitmore. Former International Math Olympiad champion. Belmont alum. Published at 16. Now a visiting scholar. I've reviewed the footage, she said. Her voice sharp. And I just watched it again live. Every single line is not only accurate, it's revolutionary. He didn't solve the problem by mimicking our rules. He redefined the approach.
Thorne froze.
Dana's eyes narrowed. You say it's untested logic? Maybe you're just unfamiliar. A former Math Olympiad champion stood up and challenged Thorne's denial. The buzz from Ronald's public demonstration had barely begun to settle before a wave of curiosity turned into a flood of investigation. Reporters, both professional and student, scrambled to uncover the story behind Belmont's mysterious janitor-turned-genius. Blogs speculated. Talk shows debated. Comment threads flooded with questions. Who was he? Where did he come from? Why hadn't anyone heard of him before? The first real clue came from a retired math professor in Boston, who tweeted, I taught Ronald Garrison when he was 15. He was the most gifted student I'd ever seen. What happened to him was criminal. That tweet went viral in hours, and suddenly the world realized Ronald hadn't come out of nowhere. He had been deliberately erased. From there the thread unraveled quickly. School records were dug up. Archived journals were unearthed. An old conference video from 1992 resurfaced, showing a teenage Ronald, lanky, confident, brilliant, presenting a mathematical model that seemed to bend the laws of classical calculus. His name was listed in MIT's recruitment database. At just 16, he had been offered a spot in their early admissions program. By 18, he co-authored a research paper on nonlinear differential equations that was cited by professors 3 times his age. And then silence. No graduation records. No follow-up research. No published work. No doctorate. It was like someone had slammed a door shut on his future and locked it tight. What filled that silence, once uncovered, turned out to be more devastating than anyone could have imagined. Public records revealed a 1993 arrest in downtown Boston. The charges: obstruction of justice and assaulting an officer. But a long-buried court exhibit told another story. Grainy black and white footage from a convenience store camera, hidden in a dusty digital archive, captured the moment in question. Ronald, barely out of high school, was being pinned against a police car after calmly asking why he was being stopped. No aggression, no raised voice, just fear and confusion. The officer claimed Ronald was being agitated and verbally aggressive. The report stated he lunged, but the video showed no such thing. It was a lie. A lie that became a charge, and a charge that became a conviction, because Ronald, like so many young black men, was advised to take a plea deal to avoid jail time. That plea deal cost him everything. His scholarship was revoked within days. MIT pulled his offer. His name was quietly erased from faculty recommendations. He never got to defend his work. He never got to finish his education. The academic world that once called him a genius closed its doors, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The story broke online and spread like wildfire. Major outlets ran headlines like "Prodigy crushed by systemic racism," and "The mathematical mind America ignored." Interviews were requested. Think pieces flooded the internet. Some called it one of the greatest intellectual losses in modern education. Others said it was a reflection of what happens when institutions punish brilliance in black skin. But for Ronald, all of it, the interviews, the attention, the praise, brought back more pain than pride. Every headline was a reminder of the life he never got to live. Every spotlight felt like a posthumous award for a man they'd buried alive decades ago. He didn't want apologies. He didn't want admiration. He wanted silence. The kind of peace that had been stolen from him one cold night in Boston by flashing lights and forged words. Students rallied in protest. They filled the quad with signs that read, "Give him his future back." And math has no color, but Belmont does. Some faculty began to distance themselves from Thorne, citing an urgent need to re-examine how brilliance is defined. Others reached out to Ronald privately, offering research fellowships, mentorship opportunities, even honorary degrees. But Ronald stayed distant, gracious, quiet. He accepted none of it. The flood of attention was overwhelming. He had spent decades building a life of silence and survival. And now, that silence was being drowned by noise. Most of it too late. Then, just as the story reached its peak, a final twist emerged, one that turned sympathy into horror. A journalist from a civil liberties watchdog group, digging deeper into Belmont's administrative records, stumbled upon a shocking connection. The arresting officer from Ronald's 1993 case in Boston, Detective Charles Hinton, was now employed at Belmont. Not just employed, promoted. Detective Hinton now held the position of head of campus security. The same detective who framed him now ran Belmont's campus security. The revelation hit Belmont like a gut punch. One moment, the campus was rallying behind the rediscovered genius of Ronald Garrison. The next, it was reeling from the fact that the very man responsible for destroying his future had been walking Belmont's halls with a badge, a title, and unchecked authority for years. Detective Charles Hinton. The same officer who slammed an 18-year-old Ronald against a patrol car in Boston. The same man who wrote the false report that cost him MIT, his research career, and decades of opportunity. Now running campus security. Now guarding the gates of the same institution where Ronald pushed a janitor's cart for 15 years. When the connection went public, there were no longer whispers. There were demands. Student groups mobilized instantly. Resign Hinton posters appeared overnight, plastered across every lecture hall and cafeteria window. Faculty members who once remained neutral issued open letters condemning not just Hinton, but Belmont's entire hiring system. How could an Ivy League institution allow a man with such a past to patrol its campus, let alone hold a leadership role? The administration responded the way institutions often do when their image is threatened, with sterile statements, vague policies, and an attempt to control the narrative. We were unaware of Mr. Hinton's full background at the time of hiring. We are conducting a full internal review. But the students weren't interested in internal reviews anymore. They had seen enough. For them, Hinton's presence wasn't just about Ronald. It was proof of something deeper, something rotten. Because if Belmont could install Ronald's oppressor in a position of authority while relegating Ronald himself to janitorial work, what did that say about its values? Its process? Its conscience? This wasn't just about a bad apple. It was about the soil. Ronald, for his part, said nothing. He had grown used to watching institutions defend the indefensible, but when he learned that Hinton had been walking past him for years, passing him in hallways, nodding politely, saying things like, "Morning, Ron," the betrayal stung in a way few things could, not because he feared Hinton anymore, but because it proved how invisible he had truly been. They hadn't just erased his past, they'd placed his persecutor above him and handed him keys to the very doors. Ronald was denied. The pressure on Belmont escalated. National outlets picked up the story. Op-eds were published daily. Students staged a sit-in outside the president's office. Alumni threatened to withhold donations. A group of black professors from universities across the country released a joint statement demanding systemic reform and full accountability. Then came a faculty meeting that would forever fracture Belmont's image, held in the Grand Oak Ridge conference room. The meeting was meant to be closed door, but audio leaked within hours. In it, a senior board member was heard saying, "This janitor has become a liability." Another responded, "We should have kept the footage internal." The minute this went viral, we lost control of the narrative. And most damning of all, we never expected him to be that smart. That single sentence set the campus ablaze. It confirmed what so many suspected, that the racism at Belmont wasn't accidental or incidental. It was strategic, embedded, designed to elevate the familiar and suppress the inconvenient. The backlash was swift. Dozens of faculty walked out of their own meetings in protest. A student-led tribunal formed, issuing public scores on each administrator's response to the crisis. Belmont's official social media pages were flooded with angry comments and calls for resignation. National figures, authors, academics, civil rights leaders joined the chorus. Still, Hinton remained silent. He refused interviews, refused to apologize, refused to step down. Until one morning, when a photo began circulating online. A grainy image of Hinton, at a bar in the 1990s, standing beside other officers, wearing a t-shirt with the words, "Comply or Cry," the same shirt some of those officers wore during the wrongful arrest protests in Boston. Within hours, he was placed on administrative leave. But for many, It wasn't enough. Because the problem had never just been Hinton. It was the system that hired him, protected him, and allowed him to stand above the very man whose life he helped dismantle. For Ronald, the pain resurfaced in waves. He had buried his past, not out of weakness, but survival. But now, it was all on display, dissected, debated, and retweeted into oblivion. His life had become a symbol, a mirror, a movement, but at its core, it was still his, and the truth was, he was tired. He sat alone in a custodial break room, as news alerts flashed on his phone. One headline read, "Belmont hires oppressor of math prodigy." Another, "Janitor or genius, the man who outsolved the system." He turned the screen face down. He hadn't asked for any of this. All he'd wanted was to solve a problem. To feel that old fire again. If only for a moment. But now, the world wanted him to become something more. A banner. A rallying cry. A political football. He wasn't sure he could carry all that weight. And then, just as things seemed like they couldn't deepen further, a student reporter from Belmont's paper, a freshman named Kira Lewis, discovered a transcript buried in the archives. It was from Ronald's original MIT application, dated over 30 years ago. In it, a professor wrote, "Ronald Garrison is not only the most gifted mathematical mind I've encountered in my career, he is a threat to the very structures that keep minds like his out." That line hit the campus like a thunderclap. It wasn't just foresight. It was prophecy. And for many, it made everything that had happened since feel inevitable. The university's board secretly met to fire Ronald. It didn't come in the form of a dramatic press release or public declaration. It came in an envelope, slipped quietly under Ronald's apartment door, on a rainy Thursday morning. Thick ivory paper, Belmont's official seal stamped in crimson wax. The kind of letter that pretended to be dignified even while delivering a betrayal. Inside was a formal notice of suspension. Due to violations of institutional protocol, including unauthorized use of academic property and disruption of classroom order, Mr. Ronald Garrison is hereby suspended from all university-affiliated facilities pending further review. That was the language. Cold. Sterile. Strategic. It didn't mention the equation, or the applause, or the revelation of the century. It painted Ronald not as a symbol of brilliance, but as a security threat, an intruder, a disruption. And to make the message perfectly clear, the one assigned to escort him off campus was none other than Charles Hinton. Still wearing his badge. Still refusing to resign. Still standing taller than justice should allow. Hinton showed up at the custodial office with 2 other security guards. Silent men in navy windbreakers. He said nothing at first, just handed Ronald a printed copy of the same letter. Ronald didn't look at it. He just stared at Hinton. Silent. Hinton broke the silence first. "Let's not make a scene, Garrison." The irony was surgical. Ronald grabbed his jacket and nodded once. "I didn't make the scene," he replied. "You did. 30 years ago." The walk to the exit was long. Students watched through windows. Some recorded on their phones. Others followed at a distance, unsure whether to intervene. The man who had just solved an impossible problem, the man whose story inspired millions, was being marched off campus like a criminal. Again. But this time, the world was watching. By the time Ronald reached the front gate, a crowd had already gathered. Word had leaked through student networks. They're suspending him. They're kicking him out. Again. Hundreds of students lined the sidewalks. Some held signs. "We see you, Ronald. Truth doesn't need tenure. He solved it. You couldn't." Ronald paused at the gate, looked back one last time. The place that once ignored him was now trying to erase him again. But this time, they weren't just erasing a janitor. They were erasing a movement. And that movement had grown teeth. In the days that followed, Belmont's administration scrambled. They tried to spin the suspension as temporary, claimed it was standard procedure to investigate breaches of academic conduct. But no one was buying it. Not anymore. The hypocrisy was too loud, too visible, too fresh. Media coverage turned savage. Major networks aired segments titled "Brilliance on Trial" and "Why Belmont Fears Ronald Garrison." Experts were brought in to dissect his math on live television. Every one of them agreed. His work was not just accurate, it was genius. The louder the support grew, the quieter Belmont became. Their silence was a confession. But then, an unexpected twist. An email. Sent to Ronald's personal inbox. No subject line. No signature. Just one sentence. "If they won't give you a platform, I will." Attached was a scanned letter of intent from a foundation Ronald had never heard of, the Whitmore Institute for Educational Equity, founded by none other than Dana Whitmore, the same math Olympiad champion who had stood up for him during the public test. The offer was staggering: full funding to develop a public lecture series, a personal research grant, a media team to help him share his story, on his terms. No strings, no gatekeepers, just freedom. Ronald stared at the screen, numb, not because he didn't want it, but because he didn't know what to do with it. For so long, he had learned to live without opportunity. Now it stood knocking, polite and patient. He closed the laptop. He needed air. He walked to the same park he used to sweep for trash back when Belmont outsourced janitorial work. The benches were slick from rain, the air heavy with coming storms. He sat beneath an old oak tree and watched students pass in the distance, unaware of how history was shifting around them. For 30 years he had carried the weight of injustice in silence. He had buried his genius beneath humility, his pain beneath labor, his past beneath survival. But maybe now was different. Maybe now silence was no longer noble. Maybe now silence was complicity. He opened his phone and typed a message. "Let's talk." A mysterious donor offered Ronald a platform to tell his story. The storm around Belmont had reached a fever pitch by the time Ronald agreed to appear on primetime television. For weeks he had avoided cameras, interviews and microphones shoved in his direction by well-meaning activists or opportunistic reporters. He had grown used to silence, not because he feared speaking, but because he had learned long ago that words carried weight he wasn't sure he could bear again. Yet when the Whitmore Institute extended their hand, and when thousands of young students began carrying signs with his name on them, something in him shifted. He realized his story was no longer just his. It had become a mirror reflecting everything institutions like Belmont tried to hide. So he sat under the bright studio lights of a national network, the Atlanta skyline glowing behind the glass wall, the hum of production equipment filling the air. He wore a charcoal blazer over his janitor's shirt, a quiet rebellion against the idea that he needed to dress up to deserve respect. Across from him sat Elaine Brooks, a journalist known not for theatrics but for cutting through the fog of public narratives with surgical precision. She studied him with a mixture of respect and gravity, as if she understood she wasn't interviewing a guest. She was documenting history. The broadcast opened with a montage that made Ronald's stomach twist, the grainy security footage of him solving the unbeatable equation, students chanting outside Belmont's gates, Charles Hinton's photo being plastered across news outlets after his suspension, files and emails leaked from Belmont's administrative servers, and finally, a still frame of Ronald sweeping a hallway, the camera zooming in slowly, as if to say, "This is where brilliance was buried." The screen faded to black, and a headline appeared: "The genius they tried to erase." Elaine turned to him. "Ronald," she began softly, "the nation has spent weeks discussing you, your past, your brilliance and your silence. But this is your moment. In your own words, where does your story begin?" Ronald took a breath. Not shallow, not trembling, just steady. "My story doesn't begin with Belmont," he said. "It begins long before, in a neighborhood where people didn't ask if you were smart. They asked if you were safe. My mother used to give me the gas bill and tell me to calculate the increase. Not because she was preparing me for anything, because we couldn't afford paper." Elaine nodded, leaning in. "And when did the world first recognize your talent?" "When I was 15, Ronald replied. "MIT came to my high school. They watched me solve something that had been unsolved in our district for decades. They told me I had a mind they didn't want to waste." His voice grew quiet. "But systems don't always agree with brilliance that comes from the wrong zip code." The interview unfolded like a confession that had been waiting 30 years to be spoken. Ronald told her about the wrongful arrest, the plea deal, and the scholarship that vanished with a single signature. He spoke of walking past academic buildings he once dreamed of entering as a scholar, not as a janitor cleaning chalk trays. He spoke of trying to hide his mind to survive, of pretending he didn't understand equations on classroom boards because he feared being accused of overstepping. Every sentence carried a quiet flame, a blend of grief and defiance. Elaine listened without interruption, letting the audience absorb the weight of a life detoured by prejudice. Then she asked, "When you walked into Lecture Hall B that night and picked up the chalk, what did it feel like?" Ronald looked down at his hands. "It felt like remembering," he whispered, "like speaking a language I had been forbidden to use. I didn't solve that equation to prove anything. I solved it because it was there, and because I had spent years pretending I didn't know how to breathe. The studio was silent, the control room muted. Even viewers across the country felt the stillness through their screens. The rawness of his words cut through the noise of politics, institutions, and debate. He wasn't a symbol, he wasn't a headline. He was a man reclaiming pieces of himself. Within minutes of the broadcast airing, social media erupted. Hashtags flooded the internet. Ronald Garrison. Stolen years. Let him teach. Belmont expose. Black brilliance unburied. Millions shared clips of Ronald describing the night his future was taken from him. Teachers assigned his interview as required viewing. Students posted videos crying, outraged at how easily an institution could erase someone. Even celebrities, actors, athletes, scientists, joined the conversation, demanding justice. But the biggest wave came from academics. Math departments across the world released statements praising Ronald's solution. Research institutions offered visiting positions. A Nobel laureate tweeted, "What he did takes intuition and genius. Institutions failed him. The world must not." 2 weeks later, Ronald stepped onto a new stage, an auditorium filled to capacity for his first public lecture sponsored by the Whitmore Institute. The event was titled, "Redefining Intelligence, From Silence to Spotlight." Cameras from multiple networks lined the walls. Students filled every seat, overflowing into aisles. Ronald approached the podium slowly, adjusting the microphone. He scanned the room not nervously, but with a sense of humility so profound it made the silence sacred. When he finally spoke, his voice carried both weight and gentleness. "I'm not here because I solved an equation," he said. "I'm here because the world finally stopped long enough to wonder why I never had the chance." He didn't open with formulas or theories. He opened with memory, his mother working overtime shifts, the teacher who snuck him library books because she saw something in him, the foster homes that mistook silence for defiance, the nights he stared at ceilings trying to solve problems not written on paper but carved into his life. He spoke about the quiet violence of being underestimated, the exhaustion of surviving brilliance in a world conditioned to fear it when it comes in black skin. Then at last he turned to the board behind him. But instead of recreating Belmont's problem, he introduced something new, a method he had developed in isolation, a cleaner, more intuitive framework for approaching recursive logic. It was original, it was elegant, and when he finished explaining it, the room rose to its feet, applauding as though witnessing a revival. Requests for collaborations poured in. International conferences reached out. High schools begged him to speak. Universities invited him to join their faculties. And then inevitably, Belmont reached out too. Their email, cold and meticulously written, arrived with rehearsed politeness. "Belmont University extends its sincere apology for any distress caused by past administrative decisions. We acknowledge Mr. Garrison's contributions to the field of mathematics and welcome the opportunity to discuss future collaboration." Not a single mention of injustice. Not a single acknowledgement of the harm done. Not a single offer of restitution. Just a legal shield disguised as courtesy. Ronald read the message twice. Unimpressed. He knew what it was. Damage control, not accountability. He closed the laptop gently, refusing to let their words dictate the end of his story. Because now the world knew the truth, and it wasn't Belmont controlling the narrative anymore. The university issued a cold, lawyer-written apology, but no justice. The email from Belmont arrived with all the warmth of a cease and desist letter. It was stamped with the university's crest, signed by legal counsel, and coded in corporate polish. No direct address to Ronald by name. No acknowledgement of what had happened. Just a cold, carefully crafted apology. The university acknowledges past misjudgments in handling certain disciplinary protocols. We deeply regret any unintentional harm caused to individuals affected. Belmont remains committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It didn't say Ronald's name once. Not when they revoked his scholarship. Not when they erased his academic legacy. Not when they let the man who arrested him walk campus halls with a gun and badge. To most, the letter felt less like an apology, and more like a blueprint for legal protection. Ronald read it once, closed the laptop and said nothing. He didn't need to, because while Belmont tried to end the story with one sterile email, the students were just getting started. Inside dorm rooms, cafes, group chats, and student unions, a fire had been lit, and it was spreading fast. A group of students from the Black Scholars Alliance released a video that went viral in a day. It began with footage of Ronald sweeping floors, Then cut to him solving the equation. Then clips of Hinton's arrest. The screen faded to black, and then one line in bold white text. You don't get to apologize to history. From there, things escalated. Students organized a truth march. Hundreds walking silently through campus, in blue uniforms to mirror Ronald's janitor attire. They marched past every building he once cleaned, stopping in front of the mathematics department, where they laid down markers in protest. The university tried to ignore it. Then came the leaks. A junior IT student discovered archived emails on the internal network, communications between senior staff discussing Ronald's suspension before the board had even voted. One line read, "Let's not make this bigger than it already is." Another, "He's brilliant, sure, but he's still a facilities worker. We can't let this flip our structure." It flipped everything. Copies of the emails were printed and posted on bulletin boards across campus. Students held impromptu readings in the quad, reciting each line like verses in a spoken-word performance. Faculty, once silent, began to speak. Dr. Nia Wallace, an African-American professor in the sociology department, went public. Belmont has long rewarded conformity over courage. Ronald didn't just solve an equation. He broke their narrative, and now they're scrambling to put the pieces back. Alumni weighed in, too. A Belmont graduate and now a respected civil rights attorney posted a video response. They invited him back with a lie. No justice, no reparation, just damage control. Shame on them. Even international academic circles began to respond. An Oxford mathematician tweeted, "This man belongs on the lecture circuit, not a janitor's rotation." Belmont owes more than words, but the real twist came from inside the mathematics department itself. A group of current students leaked copies of Professor Thorne's teaching materials. Hidden among the notes was a slide titled "Gatekeeping Problems: How to Filter Talent," a phrase Thorne used in faculty workshops. The document described how to use complex problems, not to teach, but to maintain standards. In plain terms, to weed out students who didn't fit the mold. Those slides went viral instantly. Students demanded Thorne's resignation. He refused. A sit-in followed. They occupied Lecture Hall B, the same hall where Ronald had solved the equation, and renamed it Garrison Hall, with duct tape and homemade signs. For 3 nights they slept on the floors, studied together, and gave free lessons in math, history, and protest organizing. They turned the place that once tried to erase Ronald into a shrine of resistance. When the administration tried to break the sit-in with threats of expulsion, the students live-streamed the confrontation. Tens of thousands watched as security entered the hall. They didn't remove a single student. The pressure was too high. The image too fragile. Ronald, watching from a distance, remained quiet. Every invitation to speak, every request to join a protest he declined, not because he wasn't moved, but because he understood something deeper. This moment wasn't just about him anymore. It was about all the students who had been overlooked, all the black minds that had been treated as experiments, quotas, exceptions. His silence became symbolic, not absence, but permission, a way of saying, "Take this further than I ever could." And they did. When Belmont finally offered to rename the mathematics building after Ronald, students rejected it. They called it performative. What they wanted wasn't a name change. They wanted systemic overhaul. Real scholarships for underrepresented students. Oversight committees for faculty decisions. Protections for non-faculty staff. A full audit of hiring practices and security protocols. Belmont hesitated. Until Dana Whitmore, now a major donor and educational advocate, gave them an ultimatum: enact the demands or face a full withdrawal of her foundation's funding. That same week, 3 other major donors followed suit. Belmont had no choice. The change began slowly. A formal apology was issued, this time using Ronald's full name. Policy revisions were announced, and Professor Thorne was placed on indefinite leave, pending a formal review. But still, no direct justice, no reparations, no scholarship reinstated, no official acknowledgement that Ronald's life had been stolen. And that silence, that refusal, was what kept the fight alive. Professor Thorne's old emails were leaked, revealing a chilling plan. The university swore it was just a harmless academic tradition, a challenge meant to inspire brilliance, a rite of passage for those who claim to be elite. But when Ronald's story began to unravel the polished veneer of Belmont's reputation, it wasn't long before someone asked a question no one had dared voice aloud. Why was the equation ever created in the first place? It began with a whisper, a single anonymous tip sent to the inbox of a graduate student journalist for the Belmont Echo. The subject line read, "Check the math department archives. You'll find what you're looking for." Attached were files, dozen, labeled by date, with innocuous names like faculty roundtable minutes and alumni partnership notes. But within those PDFs were conversations that didn't just raise red flags, they raised torches. Professor Elias Thorne, celebrated as a mathematical pioneer, had not simply invented the so-called unbeatable equation as an intellectual hurdle. The documents made it clear it was a weapon. One email, dated March 2016, was addressed to a private donor. The equation continues to serve its function well. Those without proper academic background, or family background frankly, wash out before midterms. Our standards remain protected. Another from 2018, addressed to a faculty colleague. If you give everyone the keys, the castle loses its gates. This equation ensures the wrong types don't make it through. But the most chilling moment came from a transcript of a 2017 internal workshop for tenured professors. Thorne's voice, recorded clearly on a staff member's phone, echoed across cyberspace as the file was uploaded and spread like wildfire. "We don't gatekeep intelligence. We filter distraction. We maintain intellectual purity in this department. Let admissions play the diversity game. We make sure what gets through stays clean." It was no longer dog whistles. It was a siren. For years, students of color had suspected something was wrong. They often felt steered away from mentorship, left off research teams, or told certain problems weren't for them. Thorne had been their academic idol and their quiet oppressor. His racism had been dressed in robes of genius, spoken in formulas and footnotes, and now it was exposed. The documents revealed a pattern, one where students from elite prep schools were quietly given access to preparatory material months before others, where grading rubrics were inconsistently applied, where those who challenged the tradition were labeled problematic or ungrateful. And worst of all, it confirmed that Ronald, decades ago, had been profiled from the moment he stepped on campus. A former professor's email described young Ronald as intellectually dangerous and the type who asks why too often. Another noted, "If given full access, he'll upend more than grades. He'll shift power." The racism wasn't accidental. It was architectural. When the leaks hit the public, Belmont tried to go into lockdown. Media inquiries were ignored. Internal networks were disabled. Press teams sent vague statements citing unauthorized access and context being removed. But context wasn't missing. It was finally visible. Students reacted first. They flooded online forums with fury and heartbreak. Dozens shared their experiences. Black and brown students recounting how they were discouraged from continuing math after their first year. How Thorne would laugh when they asked for office hours. How they were told things like, "This field isn't about feelings." Then came the protests. The mathematics building was occupied, not just by students, but alumni, visiting professors, and even former staff. They renamed it Garrison Hall and duct tape again, but this time, they came with legal petitions. A coalition filed formal complaints to the Department of Education. Civil rights lawyers offered support pro bono. The NAACP released a statement condemning Belmont's systemic racism, calling it a deliberate operation of exclusion under the disguise of academia. Ronald, now removed from Belmont entirely, remained outwardly calm. When asked by a reporter for a reaction, he said only, "It's not about me, it's about the machine, and it's been running a long time." But behind the quiet was pain. Because the truth was, Ronald had felt the racism all along. He just hadn't had the proof. Now, every doubt, every suspicion, every late-night feeling of maybe I'm not crazy, was being validated in broad daylight. The public demanded action. Belmont trustees held emergency meetings. Tenure files were reopened. Professors who had silently upheld Thorne's methods began distancing themselves. Donations dropped overnight. Students staged a "Don't Solve Their Problems" boycott, refusing to take part in any math competitions or research until justice was served. The heat was unbearable. Finally, Professor Thorne was removed from his post. Not placed on leave. Removed. But the twist came 2 days later, an offer Ronald never expected. Belmont's new interim dean, under enormous pressure from both media and financial backers, sent Ronald a personal letter, hand-signed, humble in tone. It read,
"Mr. Garrison, it is with deep respect and a long overdue sense of remorse that I write to you today. In light of the revelations regarding Professor Thorne's conduct, and in acknowledgement of your unmatched brilliance, the university formally invites you to join our faculty as lead instructor for the Advanced Theoretical Mathematics course, previously overseen by Thorne. You would have full academic freedom, administrative support, and the autonomy to redefine the curriculum.
It wasn't just a job. It was poetic. They were asking Ronald to take the seat once reserved for his oppressor, to teach in the same room where he had been denied a desk, to become the gatekeeper of the very institution that once locked him out. He read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it neatly and stared out the window for a long time. Because justice, when delayed this long, stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a test. Ronald was offered the chance to teach Thorne's class permanently. Ronald stared at the letter for nearly a week. Each time he opened it, the same questions circled. Was this justice or a trap, redemption or an invitation to wear the very robes that once crushed him? Belmont's offer wasn't just a job, it was a mirror, a test of whether he could step into a space once engineered to erase him without becoming part of its machinery. He thought about rejecting it outright. The pain was still raw, but then he thought of the students. Not the ones who had ignored him for years, but the ones who had marched, who had cried reading about his story, who had begged him to speak when he wanted to stay silent. He owed them nothing, and yet he owed them everything. So, he accepted, but with conditions. He demanded his course be open to students of all disciplines, not just math majors. He required a full audit of departmental policies, and most importantly, he asked that no student be denied access to mentorship based on background or preparation. Belmont, reeling from reputational collapse and donor pressure, agreed without hesitation. The day Ronald returned to campus, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like walking through the ashes of a fire he never lit. He walked into Lecture Hall B, the scene of his most public humiliation and most profound triumph, not as a janitor, not as a visitor, but as Professor Ronald Garrison. No applause greeted him, no red carpet, just students quietly assembling, some wide-eyed, others skeptical. He placed his satchel on the desk, pulled out a marker, and turned to the whiteboard. Then he did something no professor in Belmont's history had done. He wrote the equation, the one Thorne had weaponized, the one Ronald had solved anonymously in the dark. The room went stiff. Phones were lowered. Pens paused midair. Ronald turned to the class. "Before you even try to solve this," he said, "I want you to tell me how it makes you feel." The students blinked. He gestured to a young woman in the front. "You," he said. "What's your first thought looking at that?" She hesitated. Intimidated. "Why?" "Because it looks like something only people smarter than me are supposed to understand." He nodded. "That's not math. That's programming. And not the kind done by computers. The kind done by systems. Systems that taught you to see knowledge as a threat instead of a tool." He moved to another student, a Latino boy with thick glasses. "I feel like it's a test I wasn't prepared for." "Exactly," Ronald said. "Because no one gave you the language to decode it. Not because you can't, but because they never meant for you to." Then he stepped back and looked at the room. "This class won't be about solving problems," he said. "It'll be about reclaiming the right to even try." For the next hour, he didn't teach math. He dismantled fear. He told them about the history of how mathematics was used to gatekeep, how intellectual racism wasn't just policy, it was pedagogy. He broke down the coded phrases, "not a good fit," "lacks rigor," "needs more polish," phrases that didn't just assess, but exclude. By the end of the session, half the students were still too stunned to take notes. And Ronald? He was calm, not triumphant, just steady, as if this was what he'd been building toward his entire life. He packed his things slowly, lingered by the door as students filed out. Some thanked him, some looked at him like a myth that had become real. But as the last row emptied, Ronald noticed someone sitting alone in the back corner. An older man, white-haired, slouched in the chair like it no longer belonged to him. Elias Thorne, no longer in his tailored blazer. No more tenure badge. Just a quiet, weathered figure, watching from the shadows of a class he used to command. Ronald stared at him. No words passed between them. But the moment was heavier than any lecture. Thorne appeared in the back row, no longer a professor. Ronald's second week teaching didn't start with equations. It began with stories. Each student was asked to bring a single object that represented their relationship with learning. One brought a worn calculator. Another, a rejection letter from a school they were told they'd never get into. A third student brought nothing at all, explaining quietly, I was never told I was worth teaching. That was the classroom Ronald built, one where silence was not a lack of knowledge, but evidence of how knowledge had been denied. Lecture Hall B no longer looked like a gatekeeping arena. Desks were rearranged in circles. Notes sprawled across the walls. Students debated not only theories, but systems. They no longer whispered in class. They owned the space. Ronald had not just changed curriculum. He had changed the air. One afternoon, a student named Malik asked, "What makes a good mathematician?" Ronald paused, then responded, "Someone who never lets systems think for them." It stuck. Students began writing that phrase at the top of their notes. Never let systems think for you. The department tried to remain neutral, but neutrality was no longer an option. Ronald's class had waiting lists. Students from other majors petitioned for cross-disciplinary access. Even humanities students started attending. Belmont had never seen anything like it. Some professors bristled. Quietly, they said Ronald's class wasn't rigorous. But the students disagreed. Rigor, they argued, wasn't how long you could sit through silence. It was how deeply you could engage with truth. Ronald never once mentioned Thorne again, not to his students, not to the press. When asked about the man who once engineered his downfall, he simply said, "He taught me something, how to survive a rigged system without losing your soul." But the most powerful shift wasn't Ronald's voice. It was the voices he unlocked. In week 4, Ronald asked for volunteers to present their own equations, not just solve, but build from life. One by one, students wrote. A biracial girl named Kendra explained how she mapped systemic poverty using algebraic decay models. A neurodivergent student illustrated how fractals mirrored his emotional patterns. A trans student used number theory to explain the exhaustion of code switching. These weren't lectures, they were declarations. And then came Jamila. She was quiet, always had been. Sat front row, took notes like her life depended on them. Barely spoke. Ronald had watched her for weeks, sensing a storm behind her stillness. On the day she took the board, she didn't hesitate. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and began transcribing an equation. Not from a textbook, not from any syllabus. It was her own. The room fell silent as she moved through variables and matrices with haunting precision. Her logic was airtight, her movements fluid. Every line landed with clarity, and before anyone could process what they were witnessing, she circled the final result and stepped back. Ronald rose from his chair, eyes locked on the board. What he saw wasn't just brilliance. It was something deeper. He recognized the structure. It was the same equation Thorne had weaponized, but reimagined. Jamila had taken the bones of the problem and turned it into something beautiful, something solvable, something just. Ronald approached slowly. "How long did it take you?" he asked softly. She looked down, then up. "About 9 minutes." The class erupted. Not in mockery, not in disbelief, in awe. 9 minutes. Faster than Ronald, faster than Thorne, faster than any student Belmont had ever seen. Ronald smiled. Not with ego, with hope. Because in that moment, he knew. A young black girl in the front row solved an equation faster than Ronald ever did. In the end, Ronald realized what had taken him a lifetime to understand. It was never about math. Not truly. It was about proximity to power. About who got to be seen as brilliant. About who was allowed to fail and still be called promising. The equation had been a symptom. The system was the disease.
Belmont changed, or at least tried to. The math department was restructured. Bias training became mandatory. A permanent memorial was installed outside Lecture Hall B. Not to honor Ronald alone, but to honor those whose minds were silenced.
But Ronald had outgrown Belmont. He knew the institution could try to apologize, could try to adapt, but it would never fully atone. And it was never supposed to. His legacy no longer belonged to ivy-covered buildings. It belonged to community centers, to high school classrooms in underfunded districts, to youth programs named in his honor. It belonged to Jamila, who had gone viral for her 9-minute solution and was now being recruited by top-tier universities that for once saw past test scores and GPAs. It belonged to every student who had ever been told not you. Ronald began touring the country, not as a lecturer but as a builder. He helped launch a program called the Unbeatable Lab, where students of color from overlooked backgrounds were trained not just in math, but in confidence, in resilience, in how to own rooms designed to exclude them. In Chicago, he stood before a class of 6th graders, most of whom had never even heard of Belmont. He smiled as one boy asked, "You really beat the math guy who made the hard problem?" Ronald chuckled and said, "I didn't beat the math. I beat the lie." His words were quoted across the country. Colleges began adopting his story into ethics curriculum. Ted invited him to speak. A documentary followed, but Ronald avoided fame. He turned down a book deal, declined honorary degrees. He wasn't chasing recognition. He was reclaiming time. Meanwhile, back at Belmont, the air was different. Students walked through campus more aware. Faculty meetings were no longer whispers. Change wasn't swift, but it was undeniable. And then, quietly, without press or ceremony, Belmont's facilities department hired a new janitor. He was older, quiet, polite. He showed up early, stayed late, and never spoke unless spoken to. But on his second week, a student saw him reading a physics journal during break. Another spotted complex calculations scribbled in the margins of his notebook. Curious, a TA asked for his name. He answered, "Dr. Clarence Rowe, theoretical physicist. Cornell University, former research fellow, published author." This time, no one questioned why a man like that would be sweeping halls. Because this time, they understood. A new janitor was hired at Belmont. His resume said Doctor of Physics. No one questioned it this time. If this story made you feel something, if it reminded you of how many voices we silence before they ever speak, then don't scroll past. Type yes if you believe brilliance shouldn't have to beg for recognition. Subscribe if this broke your heart and opened your eyes.